Dr Indrajit Coomaraswamy, the former governor of the central bank, was recently inducted as a fellow of the National Academy of Sciences of Sri Lanka. The Academy sees itself as something of a national repository of wisdom, and to be elected to its fellowship, which now stands at about 125, is definitely a rare and signal honor for any Sri Lankan. On the occasion of his induction, Dr. Coomaraswamy gave a brief lecture lasting less than half an hour to the Academy's Council on the economic reforms that have been instituted in this country since 2023 that have led to the stability we see today and hopefully will lead to greater prosperity in the years to come. He explained why it is that Sri Lanka is the only country in the IMF's Asian region that has gone to the IMF for a bailout not just once, but 16 times. Why it is that the central bank is no longer allowed to lend money to the government. Why it is that our present stability owes itself entirely to the patience of the Sri Lankan people, especially the poorer segment of our community. I found myself ignorant of most of these reforms, as I suspect you will find yourselves, which is why I got the permission of the National Academy of Sciences to put this lecture in the public domain. It made me think that if only we had instituted these reforms in 1948, Sri Lanka would probably have been a more prosperous country than South Korea, perhaps even more prosperous than Japan, and who knows, Singapore. Listen.
Professor Abeysekara, my old classmate, very distinguished academics and scientists around the table. It's a great privilege, in fact a great honor really, to be inducted into the National Academy of Sciences. I sometimes think I'm a bit of an imposter really, trying to pass off as a scientist. But anyway, I'm deeply grateful to be given this honor to become an inductee of this extremely distinguished and prestigious body. So thank you for that. And I must also thank my friend Dr. Mubarak for a very, very generous introduction. Thank you for that. I'm going to really talk a little bit about the future as far as the Sri Lankan economy is concerned. I think everybody is now fairly well aware of why we went wrong and how we went wrong in terms of the past. But I do feel we have made some progress in terms of learning from our mistakes. We need to make sure that we sustain that. And there is a lot more to do to make sure that we have a sustained recovery. So that my remarks are going to be in two parts. The first is to say what we have achieved in terms of stabilizing the economy and the frameworks we have put in place to make sure that sustainability is prolonged and is durable. And the second thing is to say that we have a lot more to do to ensure that our economy is on a path of sustained transformation, sustained growth. There we are really nearer the starting line than at the finish. But as far as the stabilization and the framework for macroeconomic management is concerned, a lot has been achieved. So let me start with the good news first. And, at the time of independence, Sri Lanka was second to Japan on almost any socioeconomic indicator in Asia. As late as 1965, our per capita income was higher than higher than Singapore and South Korea. Today, Singapore's per capita income is over $80,000, South Korea over $30,000, we're at $4,300. So clearly we've regressed and regressed dramatically. Now there's complex causality, right? There are social reasons, political reasons, and some important economic reasons. And as far as the economic causality is concerned, I think one can make a strong case that the repeating bouts of macroeconomic stress that the country has experienced has been a major cause of our regression from where we were, over the last sort of 75 years. And why have we had this macroeconomic stress? My own kind of postulation is that we have had a very toxic combination of populist politics on the one hand and a deeply entrenched entitlement culture amongst the people on the other. And the two have fed off each other and really kind of given us these kind of negative feedback loops, which have led to some of the difficulties that we faced. So now what I'm going to now talk about is why I think that we have made significant progress in overcoming these bouts of macroeconomic stress. And they were repeating bouts of macro stress, as evidenced by the fact that we've had 16 IMF programs. Other than Pakistan, no other country in Asia has come anywhere near having this number of IMF programs. In fact, in the time I was in the central bank, in the period 2016 to 2019, in the 3.5 years I was there was only one country, because Pakistan is actually not part of the Asia-Pacific region because they don't want to be with India. They've gone off to the Middle East. But in the whole of the Asia-Pacific region, Sri Lanka was the only country that had an IMF program. So I see people writing and saying what a hostile world this is, and the West is keeping us down, or the East is keeping us down, or somebody else is keeping us down. Well, all the other countries in Asia have managed not to have to go to the IMF. Whereas in the time I was there, in the 3.5 years. But we constantly keep doing this. But now the good news I'd like to give is that I think we have put in place frameworks to address that. So what is this framework, or series of frameworks that have been introduced? And I would say there are 5 pillars. And as I said, this toxic combination of populist politics and entrenched entitlement culture, what it did do was lead to constant unsustainability in the government's fiscal operations. Essentially, we spent far more than we had. And we were able to do that because after 1977, we were a so-called donor darling, because we were the second country after Chile to have liberalized our economy. So the traditional donors were very keen to show good development outcomes in a country with a liberal polity and a liberal economy. So we got extremely generous amounts of foreign aid. For instance, the Victoria Dam, as you know, was funded by a grant from the UK government of about 100 million, I think, sterling. And most of the aid that we got came on very, very generous terms. 60% of the money came from the concessional windows of the World Bank and ADB. So we're talking about 10-year grace period, 30-year maturity, 1-year administration charge. So that was the kind of money that we got. And we got used to spending that type of money and living beyond our means, getting this generous support. And whenever things got a bit out of balance, we were sent off to the IMF. But those programs were relatively light, so we didn't have too much austerity. And we kept going like that. But then we graduated from low-income country status around just around 2010 was probably when we actually graduated. And we lost access to concessional money. At that point, we should have changed our behavior. And the frameworks I'm going to talk about should have been introduced then, not now. We didn't do that. We didn't change our behavior. But then we were borrowing money at 6 and 7%, not at 1%. And the maturity had come down from 30, 40 years to 5 and 10. And the money that was borrowed was not productively used, or at least some of it. And all that led to the crisis that we had as far as the debt is concerned. So what are the 5 elements of the new framework? One is the Public Finance Management Act. What that has done is to tighten the fiscal rules. And the most critical rule is that the government must have a primary surplus in the budget of 2.3% as it stands now. Primary surplus in the budget means that you meet all your current year's expenditure out of current year's income, revenue. So you are not borrowing to meet your current year's expenditure. Historically, we've borrowed every year, and the debt stock kept accumulating. So once you start getting a primary surplus, the debt stock stops accumulating. And if that surplus is fairly significant, as 2.3% the target is, then you can start paying down debt as well. So the 2.3% is the number the IMF has come up with, which says that it will take us to a position of debt sustainability by 2032. So that is the target as it is now. And what is impressive is that we have overperformed. Under this program, in the last 2 years, the government is well ahead in terms of revenue collection, in terms of achieving the primary surplus target, all that they're ahead. So that tightening of the fiscal rules has worked well, and we are beginning to see the benefits of that. The second thing is, second pillar is the Central Bank Act, which has given the central bank greater autonomy, and the Treasury presence in the governance structure of the central bank are no longer there. Earlier, the Secretary of the Treasury was on the monetary board, an ex officio member. Now there's nobody from the Treasury on the board. And the government basically has given what you call instrument autonomy. You see, now there is a claim made that the unelected officials have been given power to go off and do what they want, etc. That is not strictly true, because the key metric is the inflation target. And the inflation target for the central bank is set by the Minister of Finance in consultation with the governor and the governance bodies of the central bank. But once the target is set, the central bank has autonomy to hit the target, to use the instruments that are available to it to hit the target, and that it can do autonomously. So that is the situation there is now. And that is actually has strengthened the hand of the central bank in terms of carrying out its monetary policy in a technically competent way, rather than being dominated by the government. You see, when there are large fiscal deficits, there's a lot of aggregate demand that is pumped into the system. And that puts pressure on the inflation, and it has some of the aggregate demand leaks into the imports, and that puts pressure on the balance of payments. Now, when we earlier had this fiscal dominance in monetary policy also, where the central bank was often forced to lend to the government, deficit financing. Now that fiscal forbearance is no longer possible. Under the current Central Bank Act, the central bank cannot lend to the government. So that is a big advance in terms of addressing this excess aggregate demand in the system, which comes from fiscal forbearance in monetary policy. The second thing the central bank used to do was it used to administratively suppress the interest rates to raise money cheaply for the government. And that again leads to excess demand. And again, inflation, balance of payments. So now the regime for monetary policy formulation is called flexible inflation targeting. It is very much data dependent and forward looking. So no longer does the central bank set rates administratively. It follows this particular regime of flexible inflation targeting. It has improved its forecasting and modeling capabilities. And so this is a purely technical exercise in terms of setting monetary policy. And so you don't have this administrative setting of interest rates, which again pumps excess demand into the system. So that has been solved as well. Then the third thing is the exchange rate. Historically, governments have tried to keep the exchange rate stable, not by solid policies around the exchange rate, but by using reserves to stabilize the rate. So when there is a shortage of dollars in the market, governments often, successive governments, use their own reserves to make up for the shortfall in the supply of foreign exchange. And it doesn't work. This happens again and again. What you end up doing is you deplete your reserves, and at the end of the day, you depreciate the currency as well, with a sharp depreciation currency. So that's what we've seen often, where there's a sudden sharp depreciation in the currency, and reserves are lost. Now, as part of this flexible inflation targeting framework, the exchange rate is managed flexibly. It is based on the supply and demand conditions in the foreign exchange market. So it will be different from the past. You will still get some fluctuations because day to day the demand and supply, our foreign exchange market is only between 60 and 80 million a day. So you can get some fluctuation, but the fluctuation will be across a narrow band. So the advantage of this is, of these measures on the monetary and fiscal side, is that we should get more stable interest rates because inflation will be controlled and the interest rates therefore will be more stable and lower. So lower and more stable exchange rate, interest rates over time will be one outcome of these frameworks. And the second thing is that the exchange rate, while it will fluctuate across a fairly narrow band, we won't have these sudden sharp depreciations which could destroy a lot of wealth in the economy. So these are major advances. Those are two of the key kind of pillars of the new paradigm for macroeconomic management. The third thing is there is a Public Debt Management Act that has been passed, and Public Debt Management Office has been set up. In the past, the institutional architecture for debt management was fragmented. The External Resources Department did bilateral and multilateral debt. The Treasury Operations Department did bank borrowing, and the central bank did international sovereign bonds. Now there's going to be one office which will take care of all these things. So that, I think, should allow for a better, more holistic approach to debt management. But the challenge, of course, is to get the right people. Setting up an office is one thing, but to get the right people, and probably one would need to pay more to get the people with the right skills to get the best out of this office. Whether that our system allows for that, I don't know, but that's, I think, something going forward. This office is intended to come into existence on the beginning of next year. So that also hopefully has strengthened this framework for macro management. The fourth thing is this cost-reflective pricing for SOEs, particularly for electricity and fuel. Now, historically, what we did was we subsidized those prices, and the CPC and CEB were asked to sell below cost, but the government didn't give them the money. It should have come from the budget. If the government wanted to give subsidies, it should have been a claim on the consolidated fund. But they never gave that to them. So these losses would sit on the balance sheets of these organizations and really be transferred to the balance sheets of the state banks. So what you had were these losses which undermine the government finances, undermine the balance sheets of the state banks, and also it's a very inefficient way of providing social protection because it's untargeted, and there's a lot of evidence that shows that these subsidies, untargeted subsidies that we were giving, benefited the non-poor disproportionately. But now with the Aswasama scheme, we now have a targeted scheme for social protection. Of course, there are issues of inclusion, exclusion, all kinds of stuff which need to be cleaned up going forward. But at least now we have got the right instrument to do the social protection that is clearly necessary. So this is the kind of third pillar. Fourth pillar is this cost-effective pricing, which has cleaned up a lot of things in the system. The fifth thing is the Anti-Corruption Act and the action plan for the recommendations of the IMF governance diagnostic. Now, you can ask the question, what does corruption to do with macroeconomic management? The thing is, corruption is an implicit tax on development. Because that layer of payments that have to be made increases the hurdle rate of return on projects and also leads to a distortion of resource allocation. So the projects are given on the size of the commission, or Rohan has spoken about this at length. So all those things happen when you don't have this kind of proper system in terms of governance. And now we have between the anti-corruption legislation and this action plan which is being rolled out on the diagnostic, corruption, I think we've got a pretty good framework in place. So you take all this together, we have, I think, come to a good place. But, and what is also important is a lot of this stuff was there in the previous extended fund facility, which was there between 2015 and 2019. But with a stroke of a pen, everything was thrown out. But you can't do that anymore with a stroke of a pen because they are all now embedded in acts of parliament. So you can still, with a simple majority, get rid of them, but you have to go through parliament to do that. And this is where the responsibility lies with all the stakeholders in our society. We need to somehow make people understand that these frameworks are critical for overcoming these mistakes that we made again and again. You all will know much better than me. It was Einstein who said, right, that the definition of insanity is to do the same thing and again and expect different outcomes. I think we kind of fell into that category, I must say. So hopefully, we've learned and we've got these frameworks. We need to protect them. Now, that is the first challenge. The second challenge is how do we get growth, inclusive growth going? Here we are hardly at the beginning, really. Because historically what we've done is because we haven't undertaken the structural reform to strengthen the growth framework, what we do is when an election comes and there isn't growth, we have this playbook of unsustainable macroeconomic policies. We run large budget deficits, get the central bank to fund those deficits, get them to hold interest rates down, fix the exchange rate by depleting our reserves. All those things again and again we used to do simply because we had, there was no growth, because we didn't do the structural reforms. In the 1980s, I was seconded from the central bank to the finance ministry, and I became the late Mr. Ronnie DeMel's bag carrier. So I used to go around and listen to all his speeches. Actually, the things that he was talking about are exactly the same things we're talking about now. And then, as I mentioned to some of you earlier, the only difference is digitalization. Other than that, whether it is factor market reform, that is land, labor, capital markets and technology, the SOE reforms, trade policy reform, trade facilitation, investment promotion, the investment climate, education, training and skills development. All these things we've been talking about since the 80s, probably even earlier, but certainly since the 80s we have been talking about, and we have never been able to get these things done. So then you have to ask the question, why is it that these things don't get done? And there are possibly two reasons one could postulate. One is the gestation period of these reforms are relatively long. And the time span for our politicians is extremely short. I mean, they want immediate results, certainly not more than 4 years. Some of these things can take that long. So there isn't an incentive for them to do those things. But the bigger constraint is that while most of these reforms, or all these reforms, will benefit the economy and a large number of people, there will be a small minority who will be disadvantaged, who will be losers. Because when they open up some vested interests, those people, whether they are businesses or trade unions, will resist. And historically, they have resisted very, very effectively. The nexus between politicians and these vested interests have been so strong that you couldn't get these reforms through. So one hopes that this particular government doesn't have the same baggage, so they may have more room to maneuver. But for them, they need to make sure that the historical relationship with trade unions becomes a strength rather than a weakness. They need to be able to take the trade unions along with them in terms of convincing them about the benefits of these reforms, rather than being constrained by resistance from them. So those two constraints, which are well known, need to be addressed if we are to do the structural reforms. Growth, there are two sources of growth in the system. One is labor augmentation, right? You add more labor and you get output, and that's part of the growth story. The second component is through increased productivity, through investment, through innovation and productivity. Now for us, the first source of growth has become very muted because of our demographic dynamics. So we can't fuel growth by adding to the labor force. So that puts an even higher premium on getting productivity going, and that we have found difficult. So this time around, we have to do these reforms that I talked to you about, which I mentioned. We have to get them done, or at least a fair component of them. You can't do everything at once. But what I would like to see from this government is for them to put a package together and say, this is what we are going to do in the first phase. They are doing things, there is no doubt. But the way they're doing it individually, with individual measures, is okay. Sure, it's better than nothing, but it's better to come up with a package and say, this is our program of reform. It does two things. One is activates animal spirits within the domestic economy, and it sends a clear signal to the rest of the world also that Sri Lanka is reforming and moving forward in terms of trying to accelerate development in the country. So those are the things I think that are now there to be done, which is critical. So by conclusion, we have postponed these structural reforms forever. We can no longer do that for two reasons. One is we need to get at least 4 to 4.5% of growth to make sure that we don't have another debt default in 2026. Second thing is that the Sri Lankan people have been extraordinarily patient. The primary balance in the budget went from a deficit of 5.6% of GDP in 2023 to a surplus of 2.3% in 2024. So that is an enormous burden on the people. And a lot of it falls on the lower deciles in the income distribution. Because the wealthy have had two stock market booms in the last 3-4 years. They had these government bonds which were coming out 25%. So they have actually made a lot of money. But the vast majority of the people, and the data is there in terms of the increase in poverty, the increase in vulnerability, they have been patient so far. So unless we get high enough growth, which begins to reverse that process, we are going to have a challenge in terms of keeping people stable. And so that for those reasons, we are in a hurry. We need to be in a hurry. In sum, what we need to do is that there needs to be kind of a whole of country effort to protect this new paradigm for macroeconomic management that we have got, which is very strong now, and it is showing results already, but we need to make sure that it's maintained. And we need to do the structural reforms, which we've known about, but we need to get it done. So thank you very much. I've taken longer than I should have done.